Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. And on this edition of the Middle East Brief, we are talking to Yousuf Eltagouri, a Libya watcher, and who over the past 2 weeks has written two really interesting pieces for us here at FPRI, and you can find the links to both of them down below in the show notes about all of the recent events that have been going on in Libya. So, Yousuf, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. It's good to be here.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. So, first, for the audience, I think it's important just to set the scene. Libya's a confusing place with a lot of militias, a lot of outside actors. So, maybe just catch us up to speed about, the reason for these two pieces and what actually has been going on.
Yeah, so in the past month or so, the commander of the Libyan National Army, Khalifa Haftar, who's based in Benghazi, the eastern part of the country, has made a move to take over the capital of Libya, Tripoli, and essentially overthrow the UN-backed government. The country's really been in a stalemate in terms of the conflict that's been going on. So his recent move it's a bit of an escalation in terms of what's been happening. So within the past month or so, the war has escalated quite significantly, but the front lines have not shifted too dramatically. It's kind of gone into a bit of a stalemate, although the battlefront lines have gone back and forth between the UN-backed government and Khalifa Haftar's forces. So right now we're seeing what's going on in terms of if the LNA, Haftar's militias, his self-declared army, can really make another push towards the capital. So his strategy has primarily focused on rapid blitzkrieg type of operations that kind of swift through territory and take over cities quite quickly. So the fact that his offensive against Tripoli has stalemated is quite significant and telling of the type of army and type of method in which he uses to control parts of Libya.
Maybe you can get into a little bit about how there are two competing governments. So there's one, which is the UN. Yeah. That's fine. Which is the one that was the UN-backed and recognized government of Tripoli, versus the other one, and how Haftar fits into that whole piece.
Yeah. So we have the UN-backed Government of National Accord, which was created in 2016 by a UN agreement, and it's essentially based in Tripoli. And its military is a very loose, at this point, a loose coalition of militias, primarily from Tripoli and cities around Tripoli, Misrata, Zintan, and they kind of have formed this loose coalition to fight Haftar's army. So Haftar belongs to the government of Tobruk, and he essentially is under the umbrella of the HOR, which is the Eastern Parliament of the country. And these two governments have been rivals for the past 4 years or so. So the kind of political conflict has really developed into a military conflict on the ground with really severe consequences for the Libyan people.
Yeah, so I think that's important because within these two rival essential governments, one in Tobruk and one in Tripoli, this has brought in outside support from different outside countries who have different visions for what they want Libya to look like, and therefore have thrown their weight, political, military, economic, behind different actors. So maybe you can get into sort of those dynamics, like who is essentially backing Haftar, and then who is backing the government in Tripoli.
Yeah. So right now, Haftar is being backed by the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Russia, and his foreign backers are essentially the crux of his operations. Without them, it's very difficult to believe that Haftar will be able to thrive as a leader in the country. So right now, his army is very limited in terms of rank and file troops on the ground. And the way in which he controls territory in Libya, he often buys off militias or he pays off tribes or local leaders, local government leaders, to allow the LNA to control territory. So this method it's not sustainable, and there are not men who are willing to fight and die on his behalf. So he is going to really heavily increase his reliance on outside funding in order to make this final push. Primarily, it is likely to come from the UAE and Egypt in terms of air support, which they have previously done in 2014 and 2016 during Haftar's campaigns in Benghazi and Derna. So we're going to see a big at least a surge in terms of further involvement by those two countries. And on the flip side, we have the UN-backed government, who was essentially backed by the international community, and that has essentially shattered following President Trump's statement last week declaring his support for Haftar. And it really kind of shattered this illusion that there was a really cohesive international community and international policy for Libya in terms of supporting the UN-backed government. So at this point in time, the UN-backed government, the GNA, it's not doing too well.
Yeah. So I mean, before we switch to that, I mean.
Yeah.
Because that's important, but there's a certain other dynamic going on here within militia support that dates back to the initial conflict against the uprising against Gaddafi, which brought in sort of on one, so let's call it block, you had the Emiratis and the Egyptians primarily. The Saudis have since joined, if I have that correct, and then on the other side you sort of have the Qataris and the Turks, and so there's an international dynamic that plays out here in terms of how each external country throws its support into different militias. These are often based in different cities, who then have, are looped into this broader regional struggle, loosely defined around the role of political Islam. Would you say that's right?
Oh, of course. Yeah. So that was really manifested, as you mentioned, at the start of the 2011 revolution, when Qatar and Turkey really pushed for trying to promote political Islam in the country and trying to push their own political agendas in terms of what they wanted Libya to look like. And that had a second phase in 2014 when Haftar first came onto the scene. And there was quite a large civil war it was a proxy war between Turkey and Qatar, who were supporting the Muslim Brotherhood dominated government at the time in 2014 against Haftar's forces. And that is going to just continue it's just going to move into its third phase as the UAE, the Saudi, and the Egypt bloc try to counter any type of push by Qatar and Turkey again to try to promote promote a Muslim Brotherhood coalition that might be able to form in Tripoli if the GNA-backed militias are able to push Haftar back out of the capital.
Yeah, and so now I think is a good time to how would you say the U.S. policy has shifted? I mean, maybe it's even worth a brief diagnosis of how the U.S. got involved, its role in the coalition to topple Gaddafi, or at least to provide support for the militias on the ground that ultimately led to the toppling of Gaddafi, the pullback, and then sort of maybe what the U.S. ultimately wanted, and then we can fast forward to the Trump administration.
Sure. So the U.S. played a pretty active role in the 2011 uprising, just in terms of the support for NATO airstrikes. And they did have a pretty large presence on the ground. Gaddafi was always an adversary of the U.S. up until he decided to give up his chemical weapons program. So seeing him fall was definitely in the U.S. It was definitely one of their priorities. Not a priority, but it played out well for them. So in 2011, the U.S. was fairly involved in trying to develop Libya in parts of reconstruction, just in terms of the fallout from the civil war. And then following the 2012 Benghazi attack, the U.S. really withdrew from Libya, and they played a very passive role in the coming years, essentially up until now. So the U.S. really didn't have a lot of hands-on involvement in the country, with the exception of trying to counter ISIS and Al-Qaeda militants in the country. So between 2011 and up until now, I'd say 2019, the U.S.'s priority has primarily been focused on countering ISIS and AQIM militants in southern Libya. In addition to that, it's also another priority has been to keep the supply of oil coming through from southern Libya to its export locations in the Oil Crescent region in the north. And in the past 8 years or so, the stalemate in the country has allowed for this to happen with relative ease. So now coming back to the Trump administration's policy on Libya, at least, definitely undercut past pushes by American diplomats in Libya to push for a peace plan and to push for negotiations between the rival governments in the past few years. And that is really the extent of what American diplomats, the U.S. State Department has done in Libya, is just push for a peace plan, and that was essentially it. So the fact that Trump came out and supported one of the most polarizing figures in the country, who is leading a military operation that has killed hundreds of people so far, it really does undercut any sort of effort that the U.S. or any sort of progress that the U.S. has made in the past few years.
And wouldn't you say, I mean, like the U.S. policy, I mean, ultimately when it was the Government of National Accord, the GNA, it was U.S. policy to give support to the GNA, and that was ultimately the policy of the United States up until, and maybe you should describe the Trump call, in that there was a call between Trump and Haftar, which is, I mean, the call itself is significant, the fact that the two men are speaking. And then there was, I believe it was a readout that was issued, or was it a leak to the press, where essentially Trump reversed the policy even by his own State Department by a couple of days.
Yeah, so the U.S. policy since 2016 has been to support the UN-backed Government of National Accord, and they always claim that doing so is the only way to find a political solution to the conflict. So the U.S. never engaged. The U.S. covertly engaged with the LNA with Haftar, but they absolutely never publicly came out in terms of support for Haftar, in terms of recognizing him as any sort of real leader in the country, considering the fact that he had controlled half of the country. So they really never acknowledged Haftar as a solution to Libya's conflict. So then last week, Trump had a phone call with Haftar, which you mentioned. So the fact that he even had that phone call is significant, just in terms of the fact that the president of the United States is speaking with a rogue militia leader in a war-torn country, and then legitimizing his role in the country in terms of keeping oil coming, and in terms of his counterterrorism operations in the past. And now the Trump administration's support for his move is going to have detrimental effects to any sort of peace process or any sort of solution to this conflict in the next coming years.
Yeah, it's hard to separate, the broader Trump administration Middle East foreign policy, which appears to be largely concentrated on deepening partnerships with the Emirates, the Egyptians, and the Saudis as part of a cohesive bloc to pressure Iran, and to separate that out from what's taking place in Libya. So that this becomes a plug-in to that overarching policy of trying to assuage these partners, to try and get them all together, and basically speaking from the same page to try and realize American goals vis-a-vis Iran. Because I know there was a lot of phone calls and discussions with the Emirates in particular leading up to the Haftar call. Would you?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in terms of the relationship that John Bolton has, the NSC advisor, with the Saudis and Emiratis, and in their attempt to counter Iran, which we may see manifest in Libya and in terms of another proxy war, and in terms of that Saudi UAE bloc's attempt to isolate Qatar in terms of the Gulf Rift. And that has already manifested in Libya, and we will see possibly that happen as the Saudi UAE Egypt bloc tries to counter Iranian influence in the region. So we will possibly see even an Iranian involvement in the conflict in terms of another phase of this regional conflict being played out through a proxy war in Libya.
Right. So I think just, wrapping up here, and as we just turn, where is this going? I mean, there has been. I mean, I follow Libya from afar.
Yeah,
I'm not a Libya expert by any means. But the question is like, it has been the international policy. I mean, there is to try and get stability inside of the country, to impose a government, to try and build up some sort of institutions. And, I do know that there is lots of push for, like a veneer of elections to legitimize any future government. Is
yeah.
any of this possible with Haftar sort of knocking on the door at Tripoli with all of these divergent external actors playing out their proxy wars, on this weak state, or are we looking at like low-level civil conflict, insurgent, whatever you want to call it, for the foreseeable future? And what should the U.S. policy be if you had to make some recommendations?
Yeah, so for the foreseeable future, I don't see that happening. I can only see the civil war unraveling, even if Hifter is able to. So the way I see it unraveling the next couple months is that Hifter's, or at least the LNA's strategy, is just to hold the front line at this point until foreign intervention is on its way. I don't think Hifter at this point does not have the capability to take over Tripoli without his foreign backers, without foreign air support. So this civil war is only going to intensify as foreign actors continue to get involved. That's just in terms of Tripoli. In terms of the rest of the country, a lot his supply, his troops have definitely run thin in terms of control of other territories within the country, primarily in the south and primarily in the Oil Crescent region, where ISIS in 2016 was present in Sirte. So we may see a resurgence. Actually, most likely, we'll see a resurgence of ISIS elements and of Al Qaeda militants as they try to take advantage of the situation and the focus on Tripoli. And then to answer your question about U.S. foreign policy, it should absolutely be to support an immediate ceasefire for the time being. That should be the priority of the United States at this point. And then from there, they could recontinue onto the national not national reconciliation, but the national conference that was planned in Gdamis before this phase of the civil war happened. But for the time being, at least an immediate ceasefire, and then to the negotiation table.
With that, Yousuf, I appreciate you taking some time to come on, and I would encourage listeners to check out the two pieces below in the show notes. Just scroll down, and you can check out our FPRI's coverage via Yousuf of the ongoing conflict in Libya, and I'm certain there'll be more to come in the future. So appreciate you taking the time, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Aaron.
And thank you, everybody, for listening.